So kia ora koutou, welcome to this this December episode of SmartCon. We're super lucky to have Joe joining us. So Joe is a friend of mine. Our kids go to school together, and he's had an illustrious career in the animation industry. And I can list all the projects he's been involved with, which I will do. So he co-created Recess, co-created Lloyd in Space, but he's also been involved in a bunch of other shows that many of you will recognize, like he was a story editor on Rugrats, co-producer on Hey Arnold, and a whole bunch of other things. He now lives across the bay in Eastbourne, which is crazy to me that we have like an absolute hero from the industry living locally. And I will pass over to Joe now, who's going to walk us through some stories from his world.
Yeah, hi. So I guess I'll just see if I can figure out how to do this here. It says open system setting. Is that right? Windows. Well, maybe I'll just talk to you then.
I think that's the way to go. So I'll turn off my camera and my mic and we'll just leave it to you, Joe.
Okay, well, I guess I had a giant program set up with lots of images, but I'm having a hard time figuring out my technical stuff because I'm old, I guess, is what's happened. But I guess what I wanted to start talking with you about is just sort of the golden age. Can you guys see me? You can still see me, right? I haven't lost you. Yeah. Sort of the golden age of TV animation in the 90s and how I kind of came into it, sort of a personal history of it, and just kind of who I am and how I started out and sort of what the lessons were that I kind of learned from going through it all. And I guess the first big lesson that I was going to tell you about is just this idea that, you know, kind of like how I thought I had a goal, I had a drive, and how we all think we have, that we're in control of our destiny, basically, and that we learn and we think it's all us. And then we kind of learn early on. And I think this is what I always tell my daughter and stuff, you know, who's in her 30s now, is like, you know, you have to do this with a little help from your friends, like the Beatles say, you know, it's that it's a group of people who all come together to make something that's kind of, you know, amazing or terrible or whatever it is. That's one part of it. And then the other part of it is that history has this giant effect on you that you can't escape it. Sometimes it cuts your way and sometimes it goes the other way, and there's kind of nothing you can do. And those two things, which seem like strange lessons maybe, have kind of, I think about them a lot in my life anyway. So starting out with who I am, you know, as Matt explained, I basically, my main things in my career were, the things I'm most proud of were Rugrats, Hey Arnold, a show called Recess that's on the Disney channel even now on Disney Plus, which is probably the thing I was proudest of. But I also worked on a lot of other things like Duckman and a lot of preschool shows that are on right now and things like that. But the person that I most worked with in my life was a guy named Germain. But then my other two friends that are also, well, there are tons of friends. And also the other thing is I've had to like trim down these thoughts because, you know, you think of all the crazy things, you know, I was involved with the early days of computer animation with this company called Rhythm and Hues and all sorts of strange things that I got involved with. But the other two people is a guy named Craig Bartlett, who is a very close friend of mine, and a guy named Steve Vixton, who for the first half of my life, I was probably my closest friend in the world and who has since passed away. But he was a brilliant writer, and it was a pleasure to know him. But he was a little kooky too, so that's the other thing. But these were my friends, and together we made all these kind of shows that kind of were all over the place, basically. But I started out, but just going back to this idea of your destiny. When you're young, especially, you think that's where I want to go. That's my goal, and I'm going to do it. I'm brilliant. I can do this, right? And at the time, for me, I was this kid in Reno, Nevada, which is a place that you guys probably have heard about, but don't think much of. No reason you would. And I was just kind of like this kid. And at the time, the things that I was excited about most were movies. things like The Godfather and MASH and Jules and Jim and Paper Moon and comedies like Young Frankenstein. And also we loved all those like silent movies like Chaplin and Keaton and stuff like Harold and Maude. And this was what we didn't know at the time was this was a movement that was happening in the movies called New Hollywood, which you can read about in books like Easy Riders, Raging, stuff like that. And we didn't know. We thought, oh, this is just the way movies are. This is the way it's always been. And so a lot of us, not just me, but a lot of my generation of young guys mostly, but a lot of women too, raced down to Hollywood from all over the United States to be part of this thing, right? So again, we had this idea. This is what we want to do. And in my case, I went to UCLA, there were two big film schools in Los Angeles at the time, USC and UCLA, and I went to UCLA. And that's where I met this kind of wacky little nerdy guy, or I shouldn't say little, he's tall, named Paul Germain. And I met this guy, Steve Vixton, and a bunch of other people. And all of these people, it's interesting, as I've gone through my life, so many of them I see in the world are doing things. And I kind of got to know them. And every once in a while we'll run into each other, even in Los Angeles when I lived there. And I was like, hey, what are you doing? And one thing would lead to another. And it's this group of friends that kind of go through this bubble through history. But the other thing, so what happened anyway, getting back to UCLA. So we went to UCLA. And so Paul one summer, he got an internship and he went off and he said, I'm going to work for these guys down in who have this TV show. It's the guys who did Taxi. And we were like, okay, see you later. And he went off and worked for a guy named James L. Brooks. And he was just this intern and he never came back to school. We never knew where he went. And James L. Brooks was making this new movie and we didn't think anything of it. It was called Terms of Endearment. And so Paul's first job was on this movie. And I used to see him around. I'd see him in lines to the movies and say, hey, Paul, how you doing? How's it going? Working for James L. Brooks. Oh, great. But I didn't really think much about it. And in the meantime, Steve and I went off and we started writing screenplays together. And we had incredible success. We were probably about 23 years old. But what I didn't know at the time is people, especially now, it's true now as well, they're always looking for young writers. They want what kids are thinking because that's their main audience, right? Even though kids don't know how to tell a story really, or some do, like Quentin Tarantino did when he came out of the womb, apparently. But so Steve and I just started writing screenplays and we had all this great success and, got an agent at ICM and started selling scripts, but we couldn't get a movie made. And what we realized is New Hollywood was over. The movies they were making in those days when we were trying to sell these new Hollywood ideas like The Godfather or whatever, or Harold and Maude, they were making Lethal Weapon and Top Gun and Back to the Future and Twins and Ghostbusters and stuff like that. They weren't making those kind of personal little stories that, like The Godfather, it's a gangster story, but it's about an Italian family, it's like they weren't making those kind of movies and it was really over. And so we were kind of at wit's end. And then there was a strike in 1988 and I had a baby and everything. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. And I ended up working for an animation company that a bunch of other friends at UCLA started, which is a side story. But what we didn't realize is we were also right on the verge of this kind of a revolution, a new age, a golden age really of scripted TV animation. Now, Steve and I really weren't into animation. I was probably more into it than Steve was, but we just kind of like didn't know that history was it was changing, and we didn't even know why history was changing. Now, there's a couple things I want to come back to, just leave it, like put a pin in that's where we were right then. And then I kind of want to go backwards in time and just walk you really quickly through what animation it was historically. And so, what, when you think of animation, American animation anyway, you think of Disney and Warner Brothers, right? So Disney was, again, I have some videos and stuff, but I'll just walk you through it here. Disney had created a thing called the illusion of life. And if you think of movies like Snow White, Dumbo, Pinocchio, Bambi, whatever, they're beautifully painted backgrounds that look very realistic, or if they are stylistic, they're kind of, they look like reality behind you. And then the animation is very smooth. And it's the attempt to make it, that deer looks like how a deer runs, Even Pinocchio, he's a puppet, but he, clinks and clanks, you kind of believe it. And you believe they're alive. That's the idea. And what that means is that they're emotional. That when Dumbo is taken away from his mother, you're like, oh my God, I'm crying, right? But and so he called this the illusion of life. And these movies were all based on books that were famous, fairy tales that everybody knew, and they had scripts. So story was very important. And they would take you through this long story, this called an arc, which is what all of us writers learn. And this was very different than the Warner Brothers style. So Warner Brothers was made by these young, rebellious, subversive kids. Famously, there's Tex Avery, Chuck Jones, Bob Clampett. If you're into animation, these are all like, heroic names. And if you think of things like Porky and Daffy and Bugs and, the Roadrunner, these are not characters. First of all, just starting through it, the backgrounds are almost plain. They're just swashes of color. They don't care about the background. They're pretty. They actually created a style, but they're very different. The animation is very good, but it's called, there's two things. They're called squash and stretch. So you go boing and you go shooting off, right? They're not real, but they're funny and they're exciting to watch. And the another thing they'll snap into poses. They'll go chink, 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 chink. So it's not realistic animation. It was a little bit cheaper originally, but eventually they just got so good and got more and more money. And they were just meant to be funny. They're all about gags. They're not real. They're not emotional. If you put a dynamite in a guy's head and it blows off and his beak is over here, that's not real. So, and also more importantly, they didn't use writers. They worked out the stories on the storyboard. So they would draw them and they would just kind of work out, well, this will happen, and that'll be funny. Say they were leaning more in silent movie terms. They were leaning away from Charlie Chaplin, who was trying to be emotional and funny, to Buster Keaton, who was just, explosive. And they were kind of surreal. So if you think about it, Disney versus Warner Brothers was real versus surreal, right? Emotional versus comic. That's one of my kids running around. Story versus gags. Acting, that smooth acting of Dumbo, say, versus squash and stretch. Right. And they used scripts. They had, Disney used scripts and Warner's used storyboards. So if you think about it, in those two cases, the person who was in charge was Disney, but he was a storyteller. And the other person, the people who were in charge, were the animation directors, who were just drawers. They could draw, right? So this is a significant thing. The reason I mention this is all builds up to where I am about to be in this moment in history. Now, in the 1950s, something really interesting happened, and that was TV appeared, right? So you had shows like, The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy and Dick Van Dyke and shows like this. And these were very written shows. And the sets were very simple. They weren't shooting it wasn't John Ford. They're not going out and making Westerns, right? It's all like in a simple set. And the writer was king. And the other thing that happened in a big historical way was these networks that were putting out the TV shows, I'm sure you guys had this still in New Zealand too, they would call them the airways. So they believed legally the country, all the people in the country, the community owned the airways. This was the legal idea. And so you had CBS, NBC, ABC, and they all owned the airways, and they had really specific rules about the airways. Like, for example, there was a thing called the FCC, and it was the Federal Communications Commission, and that said you have to, since it's a public thing, there are certain rules you have to abide by, and those included things. And so there were things you couldn't do. Lucy couldn't sleep in one bed with her husband. She had to have two different beds. Jeannie from I Dream of Jeannie could never show her belly button. It was like all these rules. And one of the rules they made was kids, you have to show a certain amount of television for kids. And so it was a number of hours. And so the networks, because they're companies, just thought, well, we'll just put it on Saturday morning. Nobody ever watches Saturday morning. So Saturday morning is where TV happened for kids, right? And so they made all these kind of crazy cartoons, and they went back to Disney and they said, hey, Disney. And then Disney said, oh, I'll make a thing called the Mickey Mouse Club. And he just showed his cartoons. And the Bugs Bunny show, we'll just show our cartoons. But eventually they needed more product, right? So they started making these early examples of things like Rocky and Bullwinkle and Beanie and Cecil, which didn't really work for kids. I mean, Rocky and Bullwinkle's great, but it's not really for kids. But there was this one company called Hanna-Barbera who you guys have probably heard of, Joseph Hanna, William Barbera, and they had been making things at MGM. And the things they had been making at MGM were like Tom and Jerry cartoons. They were kind of stealing from Warner Brothers, right? But they came in and they went, wait a minute, we have a way to do this. What we'll do, and they created, if you think of the Flintstones as a good example, or the Jetsons, right? So what we'll do is we'll kind of we'll use some of the ideas from Disney, which is we'll use actors and scripts, and we'll make them funny, and they'll be kind of like, it'll just be actors, and it'll just be voice acting is the most important thing, and then we'll build off the voice acting. Very simple thing. So if you watch, like, and I have a little clip of it, but I can't show it to you, but like the Flintstones, they just keep going past the same background over and over. Everything's simple, but it's all about voice. You're just listening to these great actors, right? And if you think of something, for example, like the Flintstones, it's the Honeymooners. I mean, it's Jackie Gleason and, Art Carney, and that's, they just stole these old shows and then made kid versions of them. Now, the Flintstones was actually aired. I don't know if you know this, but the Flintstones was a prime time show. It was on at 8 o'clock at night, because it was originally, when they first got it, they was like, wow, this is an adult show. And eventually they just put it on Saturday morning, and then it took off for years and years. But it was the first primetime adult animated TV show, and it was a success. So anyway, by the 1970s and 80s, this is the style of TV animation, right? So about the time I'm about to walk in, this is the style. And so if there were things like, if you think of things like Scooby-Doo or the Smurfs or even the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, they're very simple. All those kind of lessons that they learned that Hanna-Barbera had taught, which was voice acting is the most important. Really, the animation's super simple. The backgrounds are simple. The animation, they used to do a thing called animate it on ones or two. Ones would be Disney, like every frame would be animated and be very slow. And then Warner Brothers was like snap into position. And then they would start doing things like animate on 4s and 8s, where it kind of stutters. Like when people walk, they kind of go, But you didn't care. Kids didn't care. They would watch. It was cheap, So what happened is something was about to change when I'm standing there without a job, have a kid, don't know what to do. And that was The Simpsons. The Simpsons revolution, and that changes everything. So what happens is subversive Hollywood, the people who had been making those subversive new Hollywood films, had gone over to TV in the 70s, and they made shows like All in the Family and MASH, and by the 80s it was like Cheers and Roseanne. And one of the most famous, and they're very subversive if you think of them, they're not sleeping in 2 beds anymore. You can show belly buttons, they're talking about political things like abortion and gay marriage and stuff like that, and love and sex and stuff. And so, and one of the most famous ones was a show called Taxi. So Taxi, again, I'm not sure if that's a show or not, but it was made by James L. Brooks. That name might hit you from what I was said, because that's the guy that Paul had gone to work for, and back in film school. So James L. Brooks had made a show called Mary Tyler Moore. He made the Bob Newhart show, and he made Taxi. And Taxi is probably the one that holds up the best after all these years. But he had also made, at this point, movies like Broadcast News and Say Anything. And Paul was over there working on all these things, right? And he was having a perfectly good time, But what no one had appreciated, even in was the big giant historical change that had happened, was that Ronald Reagan had been elected in 1980. Now, let me just say, I'm not a huge Ronald Reagan fan. I'm kind of a liberal. I'm a liberal. And I didn't really love Reagan, but Reagan's thing was deregulation, right? He wanted to get rid of all the rules. He thought that would make life, better for us all. It's kind of what you guys are going through now. And I, hated Reagan, but what I didn't understand was these deregulations were going to allow me to, have a career. So the first thing that happened was that he deregulated the FCC. So suddenly it's like, what, this idea of these airways things, maybe networks don't have to be this way. Maybe you could have a network that could have a little more control. And a guy named Rupert Murdoch walked in, and he bought Fox and created the Fox network, right? So Fox suddenly appears. Now Fox they want to make stuff with fewer rules, and they want to make a splash, and they want everybody to notice them, and they're trying to make all these shows. Well, they turn to the people who are at the Fox studios that they own, that they just bought. And there's a guy there named Barry Diller. Now, if you ever see a picture of Barry Diller is a fascinating guy. He's a very important guy, but he's what Mr. Burns is based on. He's like, like that kind of guy. But Barry Diller was a very,
I'll just give you a 5-minute call, Joe, because I think everyone is enjoying this very, very, very much. And also, we have the next episode will be in about 15 minutes. Okay. And so we need to transition.
Okay, I'll go quick then. Basically what happened is, I'll just go quick, is that Barry Diller turned to James Brooks and said, what are we going to do? James Brooks had a show called The Tracy Ullman Show, which was a sketch comedy show. Yeah, see, I told you, I just talk too much. That's what my thing is. But he had a sketch comedy show, and in the sketch comedy show, he said, Brooks said, we need to put something in between the sketches. And little Paul Germain is sitting there, and he says, and Brooks is looking around the room, what are we going to do? What are we going to? And somebody had given him a poster of a big thing called Life in Hell. And he goes, what about that guy up there? What about that guy? And little Paul Germain turned around and said, oh, that guy's great. I love him. You should do something with him, that Matt Groening guy. And James Brooks said, really, you do it, Paul. And Paul said, I don't know anything about animation. And he said, well, you better find out. So Paul goes off and starts getting in a room with little Matt Groening and writing sketches. And these sketches are the things that became The Simpsons. And they were these little 1-minute cartoons.
Come on, Bart. Leap into your father's arms. Come on, just like the old days.
I'm too big now, Dad. There's no way.
Come on, boy. Leap. Do it. Atta boy. Come on, Bart. You call that a leap?
So they're making these little sketches, and the thing starts taking off. And people start really, laughing. They used to do a live show before, and they used to hire like a stand-up comedy guy before the Tracy Ullman show. And the guy wouldn't get as many laughs as these little 1-minute things. And the people at Fox, Brooks said, we should make a TV show out of this. Whoops. And there's my son playing the beginning of White Stripes. Anyway, so we should make a TV show out of this. And eventually they did. And he brought in a guy named Sam Simon, and they hired a bunch of Harvard writers, and Paul suddenly felt like he had nothing they could do. So what he did is he went off to the company that actually had animated the show. They offered him a job and said, Klasky and Shupo is a couple, husband and wife. And they said, why don't you come in and develop something? Well, history had changed. And we had, at the same time that Fox had become big, cable television started becoming big. And you had things like HBO, ESPN, CNN, and each one of those things was a specific audience, right? But the one thing they didn't have was a kids channel. And so around this time, there was a woman named named Jerry Laybourne, and she was working for this company, Nickelodeon, which was just showing reruns of old TV shows. And she had been a teacher when she was young. And she said, I think we should do Saturday morning 24/7. And somebody said, oh, that's great. So then they just started showing all day cartoons. So you could wake up in the middle of the night and watch a cartoon. Well, one of her people said, why don't you make your own cartoons, and then you can own your cartoons. Now, that's the other thing about these changes that Reagan made, is these companies could own the product. So Fox owned The Simpsons, which wasn't allowed up until that time, right? And she could own these cartoons. So she went out and she put the call out. And who's the first person she's going to step to is she's looking for a Simpsons style show for kids. And again, the thing I missed, and I kind of hurried through, was that Paul needed writers. Like, he suddenly was like, well, we're going to do this we're going to write these shows just the way Sam Simon and those guys are writing The Simpsons. We're going to write these shows. So he wrote them as scripts because he didn't know how to animate, right? So anyway, so they go to Jerry Laybourne, and Jerry says, give me a pitch for your show. So he goes off, and Paul writes 20 pitches of different ideas for cartoons. And he comes with all these, some of them are like pages long. They've got artwork and big boards and all this kind of stuff. And then he's writing for a week, and the meeting's coming up. And the night before the meeting, Arlene Klasky, who was his boss, you know, the co-owner of the company, calls him and says, I have an idea. What if we do a show about babies? And Paul said, babies? Like, what about babies? And she said, well, you have a baby, I have a baby. What if we should, you know? And Paul said, you mean like 30-something? There was a show on the air at the time. It was basically about parenting. And she said, yeah, like 30-something. And Paul's like, yeah, that's going to be a good TV show. So he goes to bed and he's lying in bed. And right before he falls asleep, and this is all great ideas come this way, I think. Right before he falls asleep, he thinks, you know, when I was a kid, my mom had all these babies. I was the oldest. And I was the oldest too as well. Paul and I are both the oldest. And he said, I looked over and I looked at this new baby that showed up and I thought, he can't be that dumb. You know, he just can't be. And he had this idea. What if as soon as the adults turn their heads, the babies look around and go, come on, let's get out of here. And he just wrote on a note to himself, they can't be that dumb. That was his note. And the next day he goes to the meeting. And he's going through all his big ideas, you know, the 20-page one with all the art, this and that. And then he comes to this one thing and he just says, we got this show about babies that as soon as you know, they're not that dumb. And as soon as you turn their heads, they jump up and run. And Jerry Lehman said, sold. Go make that show. Well, they run off to make the show and they make a little pilot thing. And Gabor now, Gabor Shupo, who's from Eastern Europe, says, I want it to be a written show. I want it to be the Flintstones. I want it to be the Simpsons, but I'm not going to make it look like that. I'm going to make it look like an Eastern European indie animation. And so he draws these ugly characters, which Paul loved, because Paul wanted it to be ugly. They didn't want it to look good. They wanted it to push it as far away from Disney as possible. Because what Simpsons had done, which I didn't explain, is Simpson had married these two ideas, that you could have an emotional show that's super funny. So, you know, but he wanted it to be ugly as he could. So anyway, so they made these babies. And that's the Simpsons. That's how it came about. Now, Paul, again, like he said, he doesn't have any writers. So what does he do? He turns to his friends and he hires me and Steve, who he had known since we were in school together, to come in and work there. And we walked in and we were like, what? But we had been cranking out screenplays. We were like the only guys in the room who knew how to write, interestingly. So it was like, you know, Kingdom of the Blind kind of thing, the person with one eye. We kind of took over the show. And by the end of the first season, we had written about, you know, half the shows. And a few other people kind of were working there too. And there was a guy named Craig Bartlett who was brought in as a story editor who never story edited before. But he was an animator also. He was Matt Groening's brother-in-law is how he got the job. So anyway, we all formed this really cool, really strong friendship group. And just to tell you, I know we're about out of time, but just a real quick one. We started looking towards, and the other thing that Gabor wanted to do was break as many rules as possible. So because the FCC didn't have any control over them, they're really famous. Well, the episode where we really got excited was one called Real or Robots, where the kids think their dad is a robot. And we wanted it to be that and again, we were trying to think like, what's something from our childhood? So I went back and I was like lying on the floor one night and talking to Paul on the phone and goes, what are we going to do with this stupid idea that the kids think their dad's a robot? But we always connected it to like what was a real kid experience, because that's what we had learned to do as writers, you know, all those years, you know. And so I was just thinking, you know, I just remember getting in trouble with my dad and being scared of the dark and getting up and going into his room and waking him up and saying, Dad, and it drove him insane. Like he kept putting me to bed. It was like, and Steve said, there's something funny there. So we did it. And one of the things we wanted to do in it was they open up the dad. They see that the dad has a tattoo on his chest that says Ramona Forever. And so he had like an old girlfriend, and the people who were running, we never got any notes from Nickelodeon to stop, but they said, you can't do that. We don't want to say that Stu and his wife ever had any other relationship. And we're like, what? And we got really angry. And Gabor, who goes, that's okay, man. You know, this Eastern European, I got an idea. He said, what if when they open the thing, they think that his nipples are the bolts of the robot's chest plate, and they take a screwdriver, a wrench, and they wrench it. And we were like, really? We can't say that he had a girlfriend, but we think they'll never let us do it. He goes, oh yeah, they won't go. They'll let us do that. And they did. And it's one of the weirdest, funniest moments in the show. But anyway, the show exploded is the point. And, you know, they got a star on Hollywood Boulevard. It became this massive, massive hit. And, you know, and that's how Rugrats happened. But by the time it became, they had made movies, but we kind of wanted to do our own thing, you know. So by early 1990s, Craig, our friend Craig, we kind of all went into this room together. It doesn't matter how it happened. He ended up getting his own show based on a little claymation short he called Hey Arnold. And because Craig thought Steve and I were the best writers on the show, he brought us in and we sat there and smoked some stuff and came up with Hey Arnold. And Hey Arnold was meant to be more about that kind of junior high experience, let's say. If Rugrats was about being, you know, a little baby, this was most meant to be. So it was about crushes on girls and girls having crushes on you. Helga always was obsessed with him and stuff like that. And I have lots of stories about those years. But the problem with Hey Arnold was that there were three of us, me and Craig and Steve, and we always didn't agree on everything. And so eventually, after about 20 episodes of that, Paul came to me, my friend Paul, and he said, let's go do a show at Disney. They want to do a show with us because, again, history, Jerry Laybourne had moved over there and she wanted us to come over. So we came over and they said, and at first we didn't want to do it because it was like, we didn't like the Disney shows. It was all like bears and planes and stuff like that. And so they said you could do anything you wanted. And so we came up with the show, again, a dream the night before, not the night before, but a dream, was Recess, which is probably my favorite of all our shows because it was most exactly what we wanted it to be. Although the animation is not fancy or anything, but just the writing and the voices, and it was just really good. And Recess is still playing on Disney Plus. And by the end of the 90s, we thought we were the kings of the world, man. We could do anything we wanted, you know, script-driven animation was in control of the world. But what happened, what we didn't see happening was, again, history. Cartoon Network appeared, and they started doing these shows that were board-driven shows. And board-driven had really disappeared. I mean, there was Ren and Stimpy and a couple of other things, but board-driven shows, the old Warner Brothers style, had disappeared, but there was always a love of it among animators and among the audience. And so they did Powerpuff Girls and, you know, a bunch of things, Ben 10 and all these things. And then Nickelodeon picked up on it and they did SpongeBob. And SpongeBob kind of crushed everything in kids' TV for writers. I'm not saying, you know, there's still a writers doing shows and stuff. For the writer side. Yeah.
Hey, Joe, this is probably the worst part of my job, but I'm going to need to...
Sorry, guys.
No, I think everyone here could probably listen to another 3 hours, but unfortunately, our schedule doesn't allow for it.
That's okay. Well, listen, at least you got an idea of what I was trying to say. There's a lot more history. There's a lot more, you know, stories, but that was my life until now.
Yeah, it's super, super interesting. And do you feel that during the process, during your career, or you were less aware of the macro factors while it was happening than perhaps you are now?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think let's see. I think I became more aware of them as they were going on, you know, and I kind of thought, you know, I'm being blown around by a leaf. What? You know, and it's like, why can't we be making these movies? And there's a really interesting thing. If you guys are interested in this, there's a people are talking about this more, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, what happened to movies? What's happened to storytelling? What happened to like the mythologies that we created? And I mean, your generation and younger are much more into TikTok and, you know, other things than they are into storytelling. And even what's happened with streaming, where it's changed what storytelling's happening, I can kind of see that now, you know. And this summer has been one of the biggest historical movements since I you know, between the crash. I mean, we've had a creative crash this summer. The writer strike's nothing. AI is part of it. The purchasing of these big giant companies, the reality TV taking over everything. It's really interesting. And I don't know what's going to come out of it. And I can see it now, but it's almost like I still can't do anything about it. You know, maybe it's better not to know. I don't know.
So in the comments, Joe, we're just getting flooded with people asking you to start a podcast, come back and do episode 2, etc., etc., etc. So depending on your schedule and enthusiasm, we might come knocking on your door next in another 6 months.
That would be great. I love doing it, and I'm sorry I couldn't get the images up because they would make some of the things would make more sense. But yeah,
if you flick them through to me, I'll try to edit them in kind of post production and then circulate the video.
Sounds good. Hey,
Awesome.
Thanks for letting me do this. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
It was an absolute pleasure, Joe. I think everyone loved it so much.
Oh, cool. Well, we'll hopefully get together soon, and I'll see you later, Matt. Give me a call.
Yeah, see you later, Joe. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.